My name is Kathleen Smith, and I'm the coordinator of Inquiring Minds, which comes to you from Mensa in Toronto, Canada. And I'm very glad that you're able to join us today, and I hope that you really contribute and enjoy this session. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kris De Meyer. I met Kris at a conference in Dusseldorf while I was working in Europe. Kris and I were both in neuroscience, and he came down from London a few times to visit the Clinical Imaging Center at the University of Sussex, which is where I was located. And we would go and have a coffee and catch up. At that time, Dr. De Meyer was deeply involved in making a documentary movie called Right Between Your Ears, in which he interviewed people who had come to believe something that was not true, and they had made major life decisions as a consequence, such as quitting their jobs. These were thoughtful, educated people, which made this all the more surprising. The point of the movie was to explore the process by which people can come to believe and act upon something that is not true. From this experience, Dr. De Meyer developed a deep understanding of the relation between beliefs and actions, generalizing this to include beliefs that are based on true facts. Dr. De Meyer has used this understanding to develop his current position as the director of the Climate Action Unit at University College London. He's in demand, running workshops for environmental scientists and policymakers, both in the United Kingdom and in other countries. I watched him online when he appeared before a special committee of the UK Parliament that was investigating how to take action related to climate change. Kris is speaking to us today from the UK, and he has chosen the topic, how to activate your climate superpowers and keep your climate zen. Welcome, Kris.
Thank you, Kathleen, and nice to see you all today in different parts of the world. So I'm in the UK, it's about 7 o'clock here, but I know that you're in various time zones, and it's really exciting to be talking to people from across the world. So this session is going to have a bit of interaction in it. So at some points, I'm going to send you to breakout rooms to have discussions with one another, and then come back, and then we'll talk about the sharing that you did in those breakout rooms. And the reason for doing that is that the things that I'm going to be talking about are best linked to the experiences you already have, because that's when they will activate your climate superpowers most, when we manage to link it to the things that you already know and the things that you're already doing. I'm going to start sharing my screen here. So here we are. And as Kathleen said, this is the title of what we're doing today. This is the one that we picked for marketing purposes. What we're actually going to be doing in this session is to walk us through 2 insights from neuroscience and psychology that will help us to think differently about climate change and about how we need to activate action on climate change in ourselves and in society. All right. Let's start with that very first activity. I'm going to ask you to write down something. So think of one time where you wanted to take an action because of climate change, but you were unable to carry it out. Write down on a piece of paper in front of you the action that you wanted to take, the reason why you couldn't do it, and how that made you feel. And the action can be anything from your personal life, where you try to do something about your own carbon footprint. It can be something that you try to do in your community, something that you try to do in your job, or something that you try to do as a citizen in the political space. I'll give you 1.5 minutes to write this down, and then we'll go to breakout rooms to share that with one another. Okay, so I'm going to put you now in breakout rooms. You'll be with about 8 people per room, 7 to 8 people per room. You have about 10 minutes. That means that you've got a minute, not more, to share your example. There isn't like a facilitator in each room, so you just make sure that everyone can share the example that you've written down. And then we'll come back to the main room and we'll talk about the kind of things that you talked about in these examples.
And I'll just mention that when you're in the breakout rooms, the recording does not capture anything. It just occurs as a blank, which I can edit out after. Yes,
so you can be a little bit more personal perhaps than you would otherwise think of being. All right, I'm going to send you to those breakout rooms. There might be 1 or 2 people that I send in after this as well when they join a little bit later, but enjoy the next 10 minutes and see you back soon. People are back in 5 seconds. All right, welcome back, everyone. Hope you had some interesting examples to share in your breakout rooms. The first thing I would like to ask you is for everyone to type in the chat that sense, that feeling that you had when you couldn't carry out that action. So just a word or a phrase of like, how did you feel when you couldn't do the action that you wanted to do?
Feeling sad. Where did I start? Yeah.
So a lot of like negative feelings in there: annoyed, sad, blocked, concerned, frustration, disappointed, powerless, disempowered. A lot of frustrateds in there. Like I was living in the 20th century. I like that one. And I need to keep on trying. Yeah, that's a really good attitude towards it. So when I was like looking in my crystal ball yesterday when I was making the slides for this, I was thinking like, what's the word that they're going to put down that is capturing that challenge? And let's see what I put in my slides. That word frustrating is one that you all were talking about, feeling powerless, disempowered, frustrating, and all the other things that are related to it. Now, my guess is, from having done this activity quite a few times, is that the type of examples that you were focusing on, the things that got in the way most of the time, are usually something in the system doesn't allow you to do what you want to do. So either you didn't have the time or the money, or you didn't have the physical thing wasn't there that you needed in order to make that change happen. And so that's one set of reasons why we can't carry through with our motivation and our wish to make some change happen. And the other one may have been other people. It may have been that you tried to work with other people, or that it was other people who got in the way and who were that blockage to making that change happen. So what this activity shows is it puts a question mark with what we call the conventional wisdom about behavior change. And with the Climate Action Unit, we run into this all of the time when we work with people and organizations who want to do stuff about climate change and who want other people to do stuff about climate change. Is this idea that if only we could give people information about climate change, if only we could raise their awareness, we could generate understanding, we could change their opinions and beliefs about climate change, or even if we could like trigger those emotions like concern or fear or hope, it's kind of the opposite of the fear one, then people will act, then people will make change happen. But what the examples that you shared with each other hopefully show is that it's not that simple. Even if you have the information, the awareness, the understanding, if you feel the emotions, it's still not necessarily easy to make that change happen. Now, this is playing out at a bigger scale as well. This isn't just happening to us in our own conversations here, in our own personal lives. Let's see how that plays out when we're looking at public opinion about climate change. So I'm going to show you data from the UK, but I know from having looked at international data that for many of the countries where you are, even if you're in the US, that similar patterns are holding true at the moment. And what we're seeing here is data that's been tracking since 2005, how the UK public thinks about climate change in terms of concern. And we are seeing here in the last couple of years that the levels of concern, public concern, are an all-time high in the UK. That's the same for most countries around the world, including in the US, including despite the partisan nature of climate change there, concern has also been rising there over the last couple of years. We're seeing that it was high in the UK, at least in mid-2000s, and we call this the false dawn of climate change awareness. Climate change was not polarized in most of the world, except the US at that moment. It was starting to get polarized, but in other parts of the world, it wasn't. By and large, people were buying into the idea that there was a problem, but we weren't much doing yet about it. We weren't even having big conversations about what to do about this. There was just like a concern because lots of people were talking about it at that moment. Then there's a big dip here around 2011 and 2013. And the reasons why we have that big dip is there's quite a few coming together. So we had a couple of cold winters in Europe. The last really cold winters in Europe were happening at that time, and people's experience of weather is a big driver in how we are thinking and feeling about things like climate change. But we also had the first sort of organized skepticism emerging in the UK with a climate skeptic documentary that made it onto TV, the press that was starting to write about something called ClimateGate, where they had hacked the emails of climate scientists and released those emails into the open. And then journalists had started to pull stories out of those emails and very selectively quoted certain kinds of exchanges between climate scientists that put them in a bad light. We had the COP in Copenhagen failing. This was one of those international UN meetings. Didn't succeed in 2009, 2010. And so all of those things came together and and the final thing that I forgot is the financial crisis in 2008, which made for a lot of people an impact where they had to start thinking about other things than climate change, more their financial well-being, etc. And so all of those things came together and caused that big dip. But then, of course, from 2015 onwards, we are seeing that starting to go up again. And the reason for why it's now so high is because of the fact that it's becoming visible more and more often in extreme weather events around the world. That is then driving a bigger concern about climate change. Now, this is just concern. This is how people feel about climate change. And these same pollsters like Ipsos Mori in the US and Canada, you've got the Pew Center is doing a lot of this work. But here in Europe, it's Ipsos Mori who does a lot of that. They often also ask people about, what are you doing about climate change? Or what do you want to do about climate change? And here is one data point from another Ipsos Mori poll. So this is comparing data from 2020 to data from 2014. The dark green bars are 2020, the lighter green bars are 2014. And is asking for a number of types of actions that people can take. And what you're seeing in those 6 years, the comparison between those 6 years, is that there's hardly any movement on any of the things that people have been asked about. And that's despite concern rising 20% over that same period of time. So the concern was going up, but the willingness to act was flatlining at that particular moment in time. And the reason for this will often be very similar to the reasons you identified in your own examples that you were sharing in the breakout room. This isn't an isolated data point. There are papers and what is called meta-analyses, so that these are statistical analyses of lots of different studies. And these meta-analyses are showing that there is only a very weak to moderate correlation between people's concerns about climate change, their worry, their fear, even their anxiety, and then their willingness to take action. So that's another big question mark with that conventional wisdom about climate change. If only we communicated to people how important it was, then they would take action. What the data is telling us is that it's not that simple. Now, interestingly, in psychology at large, we've known about this since at least the 1930s. The 1930s was the first time that the psychologists were starting to show something that we could call a say-do gap, or an intention-behavior gap. You've got an intention to do one thing, and your action is actually something different. And since the 1930s, psychologists have been showing that again and again in different kinds of studies. And since the 1970s, specifically on environmental issues. And there they call it sometimes the value-action gap. So people may have lots of pro-environmental values, but it doesn't necessarily translate into their actions. And so the tragedy is that this has been sitting in academic publications, and it's not really filtering or coming out of academia and making a change happen in the real world. A lot of people that we are working with are still pursuing this conventional wisdom, are still trying to get people to become aware of something and then hoping that the change will happen. That brings us to our first insight, which is that even that most dramatic of the things that are on here, the fear, that even fear won't be enough to really drive action on a big basis. And why is that happening? Or what other data do we have to help us understand that? And here's a picture of an elephant and a person on top of the elephant, because if you have come across what is called two systems thinking about, or two systems theories about how the brain operates, which is that there is an intuitive part to our brain, which you can think of as a giant elephant, because it's most of what our brains are doing. And there's a little rider who sits on top of the elephant. That's our reasoning. That's the little voice in our head that tells a story about what we are doing and how we think about stuff. So the question here is, like, fear, which sits in the elephant, can that drive action in people? And the intuitive, automatic parts of our brain, can they be spurred on by a fearful message? And psychologists, again, health psychologists this time, have been studying this since the 1950s. They have been creating scary messages about personal health most of the time, and then seeing whether people take action when you give them that scary message. For instance, pictures of smoking, putting pictures of the damage of smoking on packages of cigarettes. That's one of the consequences of that type of research that happened since the 1950s. And so they asked the question, does instilling fear generate action? And what they found was, yes, it does, but only under very specific conditions. And those conditions are that the fear needs to feel personal. It needs to be about you and your personal well-being. And you need to accompany that fearful message by a solution that feels concrete, doable, and meaningful. And it needs to have all three of those characteristics. You need to be able to say, this is what you have to do. It then needs to become doable by that person. And meaningful, with that I mean that once you've done the action, the reason for the fear should have been taken away. And so one of the very first studies where that was tested was around vaccination against tetanus. So they would show students on a campus scary images of what happens when you attract tetanus. the health consequences that can have. And it was only when those messages were accompanied by a map of the health center where you could go and get the vaccination that people actually acted on the vaccination. So you really need to give people an action that takes away the reason for the fear. And that's the only time that using fear will be really a driver of action, and that you can even make it as scary as possible, because then it will drive action. Now, what happens otherwise? So these same studies showed that when you are scaring people, but you don't have that concrete, doable, meaningful solution together with it, people's responses become very unpredictable, and different people will respond in different ways. Here are some of the different outcomes that can happen. So sometimes it works. Sometimes there are people who say, well, I read this really scary book about climate change, like, for example, The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells was a book from a couple of years ago. I've met some people who say, I read that book and I changed my job, or I started to do something different as a result of that. So sometimes it works, but it also has in other people all of these other consequences. So it leads to that long-term anxiety where people get really worried about the idea that nobody is doing anything. It's starting to lead to like real hopelessness especially amongst younger people, where increasingly we are running into young people in their teenage years even that are saying it's too late, we're doomed. It's like we're all going to die in the next 10 years. And that's really unfortunate, because once we're losing these people to that hopelessness, they won't be part anymore of the big change that needs to happen. It leads to numbness and switching off. There are people for whom the fear is too much and they just stop paying attention and they don't want to hear about it anymore. And then finally, it's also the driver of angry rejection and denial. I have met so many climate skeptics whose first interaction with climate change was a message that was very scary, that then they started to look into, that usually was too alarmist at the moment when they looked into it. And they said, that can't happen here. These people are trying to scare me for their own benefits. They're wanting to get something out of it. And very interestingly, now that COVID has happened, it's sort of weaned away, that has been another driver of that denial coming out of scary messages, because I've seen people respond where they went like, they told us COVID was going to be very scary. It didn't turn out to be as scary. So some people came to believe that COVID wasn't as bad as other people think, or as the statistics would say. And so those people are going, and now we're seeing the same scary messages about climate change. So they're trying to do it again. They're trying to play that fear register again to make us give up our liberties, raise our taxes, those kind of things. So there's a new wave of climate denial building on the back of COVID and the way that COVID was communicated. So what's the take-home message then? Is that at the individual level, fear sometimes drives action, and you may be here because you became aware of climate change and concerned about climate change at some point, and it got you to do something about this. That's possible, and I meet lots of people, individuals, for whom that is the case. But as a communication strategy, to try and drive action across society, fear is not going to do it, because it's not going to generate uniform action. It's going to generate that very different types of responses across the population, including apathy and numbness and denial, are consequences of climate change being a scary thing that we've been communicating without sensible solutions attached to it. All right, so what's the problem with that conventional view? Why doesn't it drive action in that way? Eh? So even like just the understanding and awareness, and then concern and fear and even hope, and we could call all of that attitudes in psychological language. Why doesn't that drive behavior? The reason is we often have barriers getting in the way the system, other people, as you had in your examples, and we don't really know how to overcome them. And that brings us to words that psychologists use to describe the situation when we do know how to act based on our beliefs and our understanding. And that's the word agency. And psychologists use that to describe those situations where you know what to do instinctively and intuitively without having to think too much about it. And think about, as an example, nurses and doctors who are working in an A&E department, in an ER department, perhaps as it's called in America. In the UK, it's called A&E department, accidents and emergencies. And those people, when they're in that situation, lots of patients are coming in, prospective patients with ambulances, or they just walk into the door. And there's a lot of urgency there for those people to act on it, for the doctors and the nurses to act on it. But they have the skills and the mindset to automatically know what needs to happen. So they look at the patients, they quickly triage them in like, this one is super urgent, we need to deal with them now. These can wait a little bit longer. We'll send the right nurse or doctor to them to come and look at them. And so those doctors and nurses have a lot of agency in that situation. If you were to put me in that situation on that floor of an A&E department, I would be a headless chicken. I wouldn't know what to do. And I suspect that most of you, if you don't have a medical background, would also feel very much out of your depth in that situation. The tragedy is, when it comes to climate change, most of us are like the layperson on the floor of an A&E department. We don't really know what to do in that particular situation. And the fact that then someone shouts at us that we're in a crisis situation isn't really going to help us to do more. This lack of agency that we're experiencing, that plays out differently for us in our role as citizens, as consumers, as people who are buying stuff, and the way that we're transporting ourselves and the houses that we live in. But it also plays out differently for people who have a professional role. So we work a lot with politicians, with people working in government organizations, with people working in companies. And all of these people have things that they need to change in order to get to a society where we're tackling climate change. The problem is that all of them are stuck in that not knowing what to do with that particular situation. So we often work, for example, a pension fund manager who says, privately, I'm concerned about climate change. I have children. My children tell me how important it is. I get how important it is. I don't know how I need to change my investment approaches in order to be able to take climate change into account when I'm acting as a pension fund manager. Same with, we worked with people in the UK Parliament. They had exactly the same responses. Like, we know we want to do more, but we don't know how we can do that, basically. So how are we going to overcome that lack of agency as society and as individuals? So let's come to our second activity here, which is action realized. And I'm going to ask you now to think of an action that you took at first for any reason, but later thought of as having a pro-environmental or climate positive angle. Or if you can't think of one of the first type, you can think of the first moment when you did something for environmental or climate change reasons. And note down your action, the original reason for the action, the environmental explanation that you later on discovered for it, how it made you feel that you realized that this was good for the climate, and then any follow-on actions that led on to later. And again, those actions can be personal, community, professional, or something that you did in the civic and political space. If you can't immediately think of an action of this kind, it's okay. Once you start talking about it in the breakout rooms, you will probably be reminded of something that is similar to what other people are talking about. I'm going to give you a minute to write down the answer to the question here and then pop you back into your breakout rooms. I'm going to send you to your breakout room. See you back in 10 minutes. Same format as before. Go around the group and share your examples. See you back in a bit. So, first question, similar as before, type in the chat a word of how this made you feel once you realized that what you were doing was good for the climate or the environment. Amazing, thank you very much. So I see lots of prouds and happies and empowereds in there. That is really good to see that it has worked in that way, that the activity has worked in that way. So what this shows, or the reason why I paired the two activities, and what this shows is that the alternative to that conventional wisdom that I showed you before is to think about it swapping that arrow of causation the other way around. That a lot of the time, it's the things that we are doing that change the stuff that is inside our heads. It's not always possible for awareness and attitudes to drive our actions, but it is far more easier for the things that we are doing to change the attitudes that we have in our heads and the way that we are thinking about certain things and the way that we're feeling about certain things. So one of the big challenges that we're running into with our work all of the time is that everyone seems to think that our emotions are levers to action and behavior, but they're actually far more often the consequences of doing something. You do something, you feel a certain way as a consequence of that. So it's much more useful to think of emotions as a thing that happens once you've done something, rather than it being a predictable driver of action. Because as we saw, you can scare someone with a message, but it doesn't mean that they'll all be doing the same thing. All right, that brings us to, and you may have spotted then that the two activities that we did were to show why the conventional wisdom doesn't really work. That was the action attempted activity that we did. And then the last activity that you did now in the breakout room is the action realized one. That's the one that shows that once we start doing something, our understanding of what we are trying to do changes. And then we usually find stuff more that we can do. Just as a hands up, who could identify follow-on actions when they were thinking about this? Who could see, like, I first did one thing and then okay, nice, a couple of hands going up. That's really good. So once you start doing something, you then discover what else that you can be doing. Great, good to see that. So this is our second insight in real life actions drive beliefs. Here was the image to drive home that the actions are really doing the heavy lifting and not the belief. It's our actions that are doing the heavy lifting most of the time, and that the stuff that sits in our heads is the stuff that is being moved by the things we are doing rather than the other way around. So two further pieces of explanation here. The first one is, of course, if you have very strong beliefs about a certain thing and you do know what to do, you have that agency, then your beliefs can be drivers of action. And so all of the people who are in the last couple of months have been gluing themselves to paintings in museums or throwing cans of soup on them, they have a strong belief that climate change is a problem, and they've identified an action that they can do, which is go to the museum and do that protest. You wouldn't do that if you weren't absolutely convinced that climate change was a problem, nor if you hadn't convinced yourself that that was a sensible action to take on climate change. So, of course, when we do have strong beliefs and when we've identified actions, then our beliefs can drive our actions. But in situations where we don't have that sense of agency, it's the other way around. Our actions are driving our beliefs. And there are two reasons why this is happening, two sort of brain and psychology reasons. The first one is that once you do something, you're physically changing the world. So you may have done an action for the first time. You have realized that you could do that action. The world gave you a bit of feedback, and that makes you then able to do something more. Sometimes it's also other people that tell you, that confirm you, that make you feel confident. We saw confident in the list of words there, that make you feel confident that you can do more. Now, I'll give one example here from working with a big engineering company. They wanted to do more with their clients on climate change, but they didn't really know how to do it. So we used an activity similar to this one to get them to think about the stuff they already had done for their clients on climate change, but that they hadn't realized they were doing already. And one of them came up with an example where she said, I was in this meeting with this big building company that was going to develop a whole building site with new blocks of flats and everything. And I really wanted to talk to them about climate change, but I was sitting in that meeting and very concerned about what the reaction of that big client was going to be if I brought it up. But somehow I got the courage together and I did ask them the question, can you imagine what this site will look like in 30 years' time when climate change is become more of a problem and there are heat waves here? How can you prepare that site for that situation in the future? And that first step that she took, she got really good feedback from the client and from her colleagues on that. Like a lot of positive confirmation that that was a useful and a good question to talk about. And so the whole group around the table started to egg each other on in that situation. They started to put more questions on the table and have a really in-depth discussion about that particular development site and climate change. And what it taught that person, that engineer, building engineer, was that she could do this. She had the power to talk to her clients about climate change. And so it was that positive feedback from her colleagues and the clients that gave her that understanding that she could do more. And now she's much more at ease at doing that, at bringing up these kind of conversations. The second reason why it's happening is more of a neuroscience, neuropsychology reason, is that our brains like to justify the things that we are doing. So whenever you do something, whenever you make a choice, whenever you start taking some action, our brains automatically start justifying to ourselves that we are taking the right action. And that can have negative consequences. It's the stuff that happens with conspiracy thinkers around the QAnon stuff, where they start doing things and more and more and more, they get sort of like drawn into a world that we would think of as very, very, very strange. But it can also be put to use in situations for good, because every passionate person in the world who is pursuing some actions to make the world better, for them it has happened in the same way. They've gone through a process where they started to do something, we're justifying our own actions to ourselves, and that makes it much more likely that we'll continue on the same route. And this is really an insight that I got from working on that film that Kathleen mentioned at the beginning, Right Between Your Ears, where we had interviewed, we spent 6 weeks with people who believed that the end of the world was going to happen on a certain day. So Kathleen was very kind not to say what they believed in, because we automatically might think that those were quite crazy people. They weren't. They were everyday people that had been drawn into this because they started to act on that question, like, is the world really going to happen on that day? And so step after step, they did more, they believed a little bit more, they did a bit more. And by the time we met them a couple of weeks before the end of the world, they were completely convinced of that particular belief. And then, of course, had to deal with the consequence of it not happening. So this is really a golden nugget that is hidden deep somewhere in psychology and unfortunately not known across many branches of psychology. It's the psychologists who were studying cognitive dissonance from the 1950s onwards. Those were the ones who, for the first time almost, articulated this idea that a lot of the time it's our actions that change our beliefs. And you can see some negative consequences of that in a book from two psychologists that we worked with for the film. And the book is called Mistakes Were Made But Not By Me by Carol Tavris and Elliot Aronson. It's a wonderful read. There we focus, or the book focuses predominantly on the more negative consequences for society of that. But what we do with the Climate Action Unit is we're trying to use this principle to really accelerate the way that we're driving action across society. Because once everyone activates their own, starts on that journey of actions, doing something, and then finding out how they can do more, that's where, as a society, we will start really doing the things that we need to do to protect ourselves from climate change. So the take-home message for this insight is that as the psychologists that started to look into it in the 1950s, they call this self-persuasion, this process of actions driving beliefs, they call this self-persuasion. And they say it's the only reliable form of persuasion. So sometimes we can manage to persuade people to do something, and we can get them to change the way they think or to change the way they behave. But that's by no means a guarantee. Often people will resist what we are trying to persuade them from. But once we start doing this ourselves, once it's happening in our own heads, that's when it always works. So activating self-persuasion is a thing that we should try to do collectively for every one of us who is at least already concerned about climate change. That's the way out. That's what will take you towards the action. Second point here is that action begets more actions. Action creates more action. Once you start doing something, you will find out what the next thing is that you can do and the next thing. And then that really brings us to the last point here, this question of behavior change that you may have come across, but that we are constantly running into when we work with people in government and people in companies. It's like, how do we change people's behavior? It's not the right question. The question that we should be answering is, how can we develop our agency? How can we collectively discover how to act on climate change? And here were our take-home messages. So the only reliable form of persuasion is self-persuasion. Action leads to more action. And then that question of behavior change actually should be changed into, how do we collectively develop our agency? To my final point here, how to use these insights to activate your climate superpower and keep your climate zen. So the reason why we selected this as a title is that we know that as a society, we will need to change a lot between now and the moment that we are seriously tackling climate change, that we know that we're doing the right stuff. At the moment, we're not doing enough. So everything and everyone that needs to change between now and then, we all have that ability to activate that cycle of actions leading to more actions in us. And that's all the people in their professional roles that I mentioned before: politicians, business leaders, financial investors, journalists, teachers, people who work with community groups. All of us can change can unlock the things that we can uniquely do to help society move away from fossil fuels to a much greener and cleaner future. And that will then automatically give you your climate zen. We also run into a lot of climate anxiety at the moment, where people are really so worried and burned out about the idea that not a lot is, or not enough is happening about climate change, that it becomes really disempowering for them, massively disempowering, more than just the word disempowering. Some of them can't come out of bed anymore in the morning. And finding your agency, unlocking that cycle of action leading to action, is the antidote to it. It's the stuff that will protect you from the anxiety. And I've seen this in the people that we've helped, is once they find their own way into this, they will stop worrying and they will start becoming active in that space. And the other option is that you, so some people pursue therapy to deal with climate anxiety. unfortunately, there wouldn't be enough therapy in the world to deal with all the havoc that is coming our way if we don't manage to activate all of that agency in all of us. So here's how we do it. Create opportunities for action, because it creates deep engagement rather than shallow persuasion. It's once you activate the self-persuasion, people become deeply engaged with it, not in a shallow fashion. And the second point is it builds agency, that knowing how to act for your personal actions, the things you can do in your own life, community actions, the stuff that you can do with the people around you, professional actions, the things that you can do in your job. And you can do this individually or collectively. You can find people like yourself who want to do more on climate change and start working with them on that specific thing that you want to develop that agency on. If you're in a role where you want to communicate or have to communicate about climate change, then communicate about action. Don't communicate about climate change as a problem. Communicate about it through the things that we are doing to tackle the problem. And the two things that it does is that, first of all, it builds collective agency through social learning. Most of the agency that we have, most of the ways that we know how to deal with things have come from learning from other people. We've seen other people solve problems, and we have come to learn our own way of solving these particular problems. Big example here is Greta Thunberg, the international climate activist. She wasn't sitting in her room figuring out what she was going to do. She saw people in Florida after the school shooting, young people after one of the school shootings there, take to the street and starting to protest. And her response was, if they can do it, then I can do it as well. And she went and sat in front of the Swedish Parliament, and some years on, she's mobilized millions of people to do something similar to herself. So even those examples of people, I know that she's not university-liked, she's a bit divisive in her own right, but even people who have created a lot of action have usually done it by looking at how other people have tackled problems. And that brings us to the second point here, is this is really important because it helps people to understand how to change. And that's what we need to do rather than telling people what to change. So we need recipes and cookbooks for climate action. We don't need menu lists, because that's not really working at the moment. There's a paper that I've written together with colleagues about this, which I will make sure that you can access later on. Here are a couple of other links where you can find out more about this. So the paper, another article, and then 3 podcasts, and including the evidence that I gave to the Parliament in the UK. That's some YouTube videos where you can find out some more about this. We've got a bit of time for questions.
So if the questioning starts to get crowded, then I'll invite you to raise your hand. There's a button inside the reactions for that. But otherwise, you can just jump in.
It's not a question, but it's a request. Can you put those links into the chat so we can copy them and use them? Because I couldn't get them off the slide.
I can email them to everybody.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Sophie.
Yes, I have a question. Thanks a lot for your presentation, Kris. In fact, with education is a key, if I can listen to you. If we learn new action to our children, it will make the difference, because they will be put into action from the beginning, and I think they will be proud. So isn't the best way to act now?
Yes, indeed. So education is really key. And the interesting thing is that, like, it's not education about climate change that is key. It's education about the things that we need to do about climate change. That is the key. And if we think, as an example, a parallel, how we are being taught by our parents to keep ourselves safe in traffic is not with lectures of how we can die in traffic. Our parents took us out on the roads, made us look left and right when we were crossing the street. And it was really through those actions that we learned to keep ourselves safe, not by being told how we were going to die if we didn't keep ourselves safe. And yet on climate, we're stuck in that doom loop where we only keep on saying how bad things are going to be.
Elke?
Yeah, I want to talk about another issue related to this. And I am finding very often now when I'm involved in many of the groups and activities around climate change and other issues, social rights issues, that I'm dealing with organizations that are so entrenched that the people who are coming to them and are involved in them are now coming for a different reason for which the organization was first established. And for many of them, it's become almost a social thing. And what's happening is I'm quitting many of them. I'm leaving many of them because I'm banging my head against a brick wall, you know. They will not change what they do. And I keep telling them, you've got to do something. You've got to set out why are you doing it, how you're going to measure the results. And if you don't get a successful thing, you don't do it again. And they ignore that and they keep doing it again and again. And I think that's one of the problems. We have a lot of groups going around doing things and they're repeating ineffectual actions. And I have no way to break through. So, yeah.
Yes, it's a big problem. And there's one of the things that we didn't really talk about is that the negative side effect of the self-persuasion is the fragmentation of what people are pursuing in terms of meaningful action on climate change. Because once you are, if you don't feel, so you're a person and you're massively concerned about climate change, you're looking around, what is it that you can do? And you look in on a subset of things that feel meaningful to you. And we see extreme examples of that in the protesters who are going to throw cans of soup at paintings. Even more extreme, recently, someone killed themselves over in front of the White House, I think, in order to press home how urgent climate change was. And so different people are being drawn to different kinds of actions. And that then makes that there is this splintering happening of different groups that are pursuing certain kinds of actions. And my answer then would be, Elke, if it doesn't feel meaningful to you, the things that they're doing, then find groups of people or find a new group of people or start a new group of people by which you can then enter that cycle of action leading to more action that really works for you.
That's exactly what I did. But before doing that, I really tried to make a change and to make an emphasis. But the thing is, I didn't just hang on. I didn't just complain and hang on. I tried to change. They wouldn't change. I walked away and went somewhere else. Yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. It's because once we've gone through that cycle of self-persuasion, we're very convinced, all of us, that we're doing the right thing. And that's okay, in a sense, that if we then have plurality of action, if we have many different groups doing many different things, then hopefully enough of us will be doing enough in order to make society transition away from where we are at the moment.
Before I call on Sophie, I'll just make a quick comment of my own, that a long time ago I was involved in a church group, and we were a group of, I was one of the youngest ones by far, but the ladies were very dependent on their husbands for a lot of things, and we were pre-feminist. And so these women came and joined us and as members of the group, and they decided that they would kind of try to switch us into thinking in a more feminist light and be more independent. And they used humor. They would have us engage in these really funny games and so on. And it kind of worked, you know, it was funny and it got into our brains and we started seeing things differently. So I'll just throw that out. Sophie, did you want to say something?
Yes, it was more a question. I know that regulation is not very fun and it's very people, but as climate change should be quick and action can be long, I was wondering what was your point of view of putting more regulations to make people act quickly.
Yes, and the regulation can come in different shapes and forms. So we could try to regulate individuals' behaviors, and that would generate a lot of opposition. You would have lots of people coming to different conclusions about the rightness of that approach, and it would probably slow us down. But there are ways to regulate that you can actually accelerate the uptake of good behavior and move us away from bad behavior. One of the positive things that we've been seeing happening in the last couple of years is the exponential uptake of renewable technologies around the world, not just solar and wind, but all the associated technologies like batteries and the production of green hydrogen. All of them are on exponential growth pathways. And those can be helped with regulation. So driving the uptake of the right type of approaches can be helped with regulation. In Norway, Norway is the front runner on electric vehicles. They have done a lot of different things, but one of them was use taxes and subsidies in such a way that already a few years ago, it became cheaper to own an electric vehicle in Norway than a petrol vehicle. They also used regulation to really accelerate the rollout of the charging infrastructure that you need for electric cars. And by using regulation in that very smart way, in a couple of years' time, they tipped the whole market in Norway away from fossil fuel cars to electric cars. And it's that kind of way that we need to use regulation. There's a really interesting paper being written by people that we work with on they call it upward scaling tipping points. We need to activate upward scaling tipping points in the economy. I'll make sure that I send that to Kathleen as well, so you can go and look in that paper if you're interested.
Thanks.
So yes, making green affordable is really an important part of that. Yeah,
Melanie, looks like you have a question.
Yeah.
Hello, it's actually Peter, Melanie's partner here. There's my experience has been here in Canada, sort of on a national scale. There's a real conflict between what needs to be done to fight climate change, to mitigate the effects of climate change, which are long-term expensive behaviors on the national level. There are a lot of people who perceive that they will immediately suffer loss of jobs, whatever. We have a huge fossil fuel industry here in Canada. Thousands upon thousands of people work in that industry, and they fear that if we implement actions that would mitigate climate change, they will lose their livelihood, their income. Their families will suffer. Unemployment, no food, no house, whatever. And it seems to be difficult to find people who present a solution that solves both the climate issue and the, let's say, unemployment issue. And I don't know how to bring that kind of conversation about.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And couple of points of answer. So the first one is that until maybe 5 years ago, it looked indeed as if action on climate change was going to be very, very expensive at like a global scale. So let's talk about the global scale at first. But what we're now seeing with this exponential uptake of these renewable technologies is that they're also coming down in price. The more we're installing of these kinds of technologies, the cheaper they are becoming. And I'll make sure that there's another link to a report included in my email to Kathleen, where we worked with economists in Oxford who are looking at how much we can actually be saving if we are making that transition away from fossil fuel technologies to renewable technologies. We could be saving trillions and trillions of dollars globally on energy if we are making that transition faster than it currently is going. That doesn't then yet answer that question about the individuals who feel that their livelihoods may be threatened. And for that, we need what is called, amongst people who are working on this, a just transition. You need to think about, like, how can we make sure that all of the things that all of the policies that we're bringing in, make sure that people aren't losing out massively as a result of this. And I don't have the answer for Canada and its oil industry and gas industry at the moment, but individual companies have been trying to resolve that. For example, Audi, the car maker in Germany, has guaranteed all of its staff 10 years to remain employed while they're making a transition away from fossil fuel cars to electric cars. So, and the reason why they did is because Volkswagen, which is one of their competitors, had announced that they were going to make a big transition away to electric vehicles, had not given that guarantee to their workers, and had caused a lot of mayhem and a lot of unhappiness amongst their workers. So you now see Audi trying to go against that and to make sure that they're not falling into the same problems. So what that means for individual nations and the way that their economies need to shift, for some it's going to be easier than others. So places like Australia and Saudi Arabia are currently very much dependent on exports of fossil fuels, like coal in the case of Australia, and oil, of course, in the case of the Saudis. But at the same time, they are building giant new energy parks where they're using the sun and the wind that they have a lot of in those places to generate electricity with solar and wind mills. And then they're using that electricity to create green hydrogen, to transform that into ammonia, and the ammonia can be shipped to other parts of the world, can be transformed back into hydrogen, and can be then used in the energy system to create electricity. So, and that's despite those countries having very strong vested interests in those existing fossil fuel sectors, because the economics of all of this is shifting. That change is happening in those countries as well. And I don't know if the same would apply to Canada. It may not be as sun-rich as Australia is, but perhaps it will find its own way to deal with the reshifting of the industry that needs to happen.
And Felicia.
So I have a question that's not specifically related to climate change, but is related to kind of the whole concept of what drives our actions. Do you have any comments or thoughts on if we are taking an action that we think is being helpful, and then we find out it's no longer helpful or it's not as helpful to the environment, things that we can do to help ourselves get out of that fallacy of, and I need to actually stop doing the behavior that I'm doing?
That's a really good question. And that's indeed the flip side of that self-justification the self-justification trap. If we have started to do something and then all of a sudden someone comes and tells us that it's not the right thing, then it could create cognitive dissonance and resistance to change in people. So the answer would be for us to become aware of the fact that this can happen, such that we can let go of that as quickly as possible. And that's where a book like Mistakes Were Made, but not by me, the one that I mentioned before, is really helpful, because it really tries people to become equipped to do that kind of letting go of the things that you felt were really important to you. Two examples where I've seen this play out is one, about 10 years ago in Europe, there was a campaign to move people to diesel, from gasoline to diesel cars. And the reason was that diesel cars were more fuel efficient and were generating less carbon emissions. but they are generating other kinds of emissions that are causing much more air pollution locally in towns and cities. Now, interestingly, some car companies, Volkswagen in particular, had fiddled their test results and had started to be very effective in selling diesel cars across Europe that were much worse for air pollution than people were led to believe. And so lots of people who made that shift to diesel back in the day, thinking they were doing the right thing, then had to confront this thing that it was not the right thing, basically. And that was difficult for lots of people. Another example is one of my colleagues is a climate scientist, and he was at a conference, a geology conference. And geology is an interesting domain because it has the sciences in it that study climate change, but it also has a lot of people working for oil companies in that sector. And so whenever you have a geology conference, you've got people from these different professions basically in the room. And this climate professor had been talking about what climate change was doing to the world and how we needed to act and all of that. And at the end of the talk, a petrochemical engineer comes up to him and says, "You're trying to make me believe that I'm a bad person, but I know the good that oil did around the world in that it lifted people out of poverty, and you're not getting anywhere with making me feel a bad person." So here's an example of someone who correctly believed that oil, like access to energy, had played a big role in the reduction of poverty around the world and in the securing a food supply for people around the world. And here he was confronted with the idea that perhaps it had consequences that weren't so positive. It was really impossible for that person to deal with that situation.
Ben, you put something into the chat. Did you want to mention what it is? Oh, he has no voice today. Okay. So, hi, Ben. So could you please email me the link and then I can share it with everybody? Ben says he has no voice today.
There's a comment of Michelina as well.
Yeah, we were having a little bit of a discussion on the economic incentives behind that. And I was just reflecting on some of that is like the models of valuation. So part of it's like the way we're looking at things. And then I just thought of like regenerative agriculture, sustainable farming. We're looking at the economic hit to the livelihood of farmers, for example. But if we start to rethink about how we're valuing what farmers produce, and they're not just producing food for human consumption, but they're also producing like ecosystem services for all of society and food for maybe like animals and other things, it might be a different way of looking at an economic argument. Because I think part of the reason that economic valuation comes into tension with the environment so many times in our social challenges is maybe our models of valuation that need to shift to keep up with that.
Yes, thank you for that. Absolutely agree with that. And there's lots of projects where we are trying to activate that different valuation. So there's one in particular, we call it the Wales Transition Lab, where we're working with people in food farming, health, nature and conservation as well. And we're trying to get them connected to solve that problem together, because you can't get the farmers to shift their food production if you don't have all of the other sectors in society in play as well, because that's how you bring the reevaluation, the different valuation of the benefits that farmers bring to society. And we're about to start a project where we're going to try and shift the 10,000 farmers sitting in one valley in Wales all at once to regen agriculture. But that needs to bring investment on board, that needs to bring the whole public sector on board, health, because there will be lots of health benefits for people coming out of that. All the environmental protection agencies, etc., they all need to become part of that conversation. So in about a year's time, we will know whether we've been successful in that particular example.
I will call on Elke in a moment. It just occurs to me to say that another possible strategy is to work with children, getting them to do some kind of a climate action like a project or whatever, and just get the ball rolling with the kids.
Yes, absolutely. And that's a big one. We are working also with teachers and with schools and with people who teach the teachers, because at the moment in the UK, at least, again, I don't know how it is where you are, but in the UK, teachers feel powerless, don't know what to do in this particular situation, and feel under a lot of pressure from young people who are asking things from them, but then don't really know how to help their pupils, how to help their students with that. So yeah.
Elka.
Yeah, I don't know to what extent this applies to the rest of the world, but in Canada, we've had over maybe the last 20 years, a very negative switch, switch from where the levers of power are in our governments. So a great deal of the decision making, which used to take place in the parliament, in open discussion, no longer sees the light of day. So much power has moved into the offices of the provincial premiers and the federal prime minister that this great decisions are made over which we have no control whatsoever. And the other big problem related to that is the increased use of omnibus bills, where you get one bill that comes forward with like 900 things on it, you know. And another problem that we face in Canada that you often don't face in the rest of the world is we often have majority governments. Majority governments work like autocrats. There's no accountability for anything because we still have first past the post, you know. So it's totally awful. And we've seen Doug Ford here trying again and again. The one lesson he's really learned is that the power of the people are the closer they are to their government. So we are the closest to our municipal governments. So he set about very, very systematically to destroy it. He started with Toronto, where he's more and more and more to the point now where he's got this, you know, strong mayor, which is not, you know, because a strong mayor, he can only override things if it fits the provincial law, not because it's to the benefit of the people. So it's because he tried to amalgamate all of Halton into Halton City. So this is we are not a democracy. Canada's a democracy in name only. We are not really a democracy. And I don't know about the rest of the world, but you judge a democracy by the institutions, not by voting. Yeah. Anyway, I feel better having aired that.
There are very similar problems in the UK with the first past the post system and majority governments that switch and decisions moving out of sight and everything. And I guess what this shows is that climate's not an isolated problem. Climate is a problem that perfuses every aspect of society, and having a good governance system is really important for us to be able to tackle climate change. And so one of the things that we're doing is also looking at like what's the relation between governance systems at the local government level, at the national government level, and then the action that can follow. And we're seeing, for example, here in the UK, we've got 4 different nations, Scotland, Wales, England, and Northern Ireland. And it's at this moment a lot easier to do interesting systemic change stuff in Wales and Scotland because there is a leadership that wants to support that kind of change. And it's much harder to do the same in Northern Ireland and England because there is much less of that willingness to do that systems change at the moment. Right.
Shay, did you want to say something about the electric flight?
Sure, I can. Yeah. So I'm in the US and I'm working for a company that's actually developing some of the electric aircraft right now. It's exciting stuff, but it's only with battery tech the way it is right now. It's only really practical for small planes like little single engine trainers. But Airbus and I think Boeing are currently working on prototypes and development for scaling that to more of a like regional jet size. So it's probably a decade away realistically, but there is a lot of work going on in that area to try to take fossil fuels out of aviation as well.
Yeah, I've heard of similar things around development of hydrogen engines, which would also be zero emissions if the hydrogen is produced with renewable electricity. And that's the only way that we're going to get rid of carbon emissions in that area. People are not going to give up flying, especially if you live in a place where the distances are really, really big. In Europe, it's much easier to get around by train, but in the US and Canada, it's a lot harder, I think. Yeah,
I see that hydrogen being the way to get away from diesel with cargo shipping as well. So hopefully there's activity in that area too.
There is, yeah, absolutely.
And Paul, did you want to, I'm inviting you to say something about your experience in your neighborhood, if you'd like.
Sure, thanks, Kathleen. I'd be happy to. What Kathleen is referring to is what we're calling the Pocket Change Project. Those that were in the breakout room with me heard this. I live in a neighborhood in the east end of Toronto that is called the Pocket. And we're working together as a community, neighbors helping neighbors, in order to get our houses off of fossil fuels. Most of our houses are heated using natural gas, which we know is anything but natural, not natural in a good way. It's mostly toxic methane that we're pumping into our houses and that are leaking, even when our gas stoves are off or even when our furnaces aren't firing. Leaking toxic methane into the environment and into our houses. So we're working as a group to eliminate those fossil fuels from our neighbors' homes, really taking on what Kris said, the idea of helping people to find actionable things that they can do, leading by example. My own house in the neighborhood is an example that anybody in the neighborhood is welcome to tour at almost any time, so long as I'm not sleeping or showering. They're welcome to come and tour almost any time. I can show them what I did, how I did it, how I could afford it, all of those things. We now have 22 other homes in the neighborhood that we're calling change makers that are in the process. And of course, that is creating an enormous snowball effect, which is exactly what we want to do. We want each of those 22 houses to beget another 22 houses each. So the process of collaborating with the city of Toronto to roll out this model all across the city to help other neighborhoods to catch up with us. So I think that perhaps that's an example that supports almost everything that Kris said here. So thank you for your positive affirmations, Kris.
Thanks for that wonderful example. It's indeed bringing it to life, the way that change will start snowballing as more and more people start doing that.
And Sophie.
Yes, another question. Mensa is an international association, and I would really appreciate your point of view on what could be done to show some recipes within such an association for helping people to act more. So if you have any ideas, we tried something and I think it's not so efficient. So maybe other ideas would be welcome if you have any ideas, Kris, people or so maybe.
So can you send me an email address in case people ask me for it so they can get in touch with you if they don't know how to get in touch with you?
Yes, of course.
And I just cut somebody off. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was saying that it's by joining forces. So someone said there is the Mensans for Sustainability group. So maybe that's one way to do it. Maybe the Facebook group format is not the thing that works for you. Then I would suggest find Mensans or other groups of people that you can meet face to face and then start working out what can be done. I think perhaps it is, if I don't know what Mensa could be doing more. I'm not part of Mensa, so I don't know how this organization works. But again, focusing on recipes and the how rather than telling people what to change would be a good way, or giving these sharing these positive examples. So Paul's example, Shay's example, they're all very nice examples of the type of stuff that is happening and the type of stuff that we need to do more of to make that big change happen.
Yes. Yes, in fact, Mensa for Sustainability, I know people that created it and it's not working so well. So we tried another group that we launched in Europe, and it does not have so much success. So that's why I was wondering if you have other ideas. But yes, we will continue this way. So I hope we will have more success in the future. So if some people today want to join, we met every month. So for the moment, it's mainly German people and French people, and some of Thailand. But Maggie, for those who know her, who is very active, but at the moment it's only a few of us. So if other people are really welcome for the good idea, and I think we have to improve a lot.
Okay.
So, well, Kris, I would really like to say thank you for leading us in this very inspiring discussion, switching us from anxiety and fear into hope, and in some cases a sense of agency itself. And the big message that you have, which is really quite intriguing, is that when we start to take actions, even if it's for a different reason, that helps the environment, then we start to think of ourselves as people who are contributing in a positive way to what's happening with the climate. So thank you very much for inspiring us, for giving us this how-to attitude, how to get to a sense of agency. It's very important. And so on behalf of Toronto Mensa, Kris, I'd like to say thank you very much. And we will be sending you a small gift as a token of our appreciation.
It's been my pleasure, and thanks for all your interaction and brilliant examples and everything. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, so anyone who has put a message into the chat about how to reach you, please also email it to me in case I have any difficulty seeing it when I try to get the report from the chat, so that I can spread it to everybody else. So we will come to an end now. And thank you so much to the audience. You've been wonderful, and it was great to see you all. So we'll say goodbye.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. It was very informative.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.